There's something very strange happening in modern society that more and more people can feel, but very few are willing to say out loud. We are watching millions of people becoming disconnected from who they truly are, disconnected from their history, disconnected from their communities, disconnected from their purpose, but also disconnected from each other. And the strange thing is, this is happening in the most technologically advanced and materially comfortable societies human beings have ever created. So why do so many people feel empty? Why are anxiety, loneliness and division exploding everywhere? And why do so many people feel like strangers in their own country? Because I don't just think this crisis is political. I think it's spiritual and civilizational. I think somewhere along the line, we stopped passing down the things that used to hold our societies together. Strong families, strong values, pride in who you are and where you come from, responsibility to something bigger than yourself, faith, community, and belonging. You know, previous generations understood something modern society is beginning to forget. Freedom alone is not enough to hold a civilization together. People also need meaning. For thousands of years, ordinary men and women have sacrificed comfort, safety, and sometimes even their lives because they believed that their future mattered. You know, men fought wars, crossed oceans, and worked in brutal jobs just to provide stability for their families. Women held the families together through hardship, raised children during war when the men were absent, carried communities through the loss and sacrifice, and then passed those values from one generation to the next. You know, entire generations endured massive suffering because they believed that their children deserved something better than they had. Think about that. You know, people suffered for descendants they would never even meet. And now we stand here benefiting from everything that they built, whilst being told that we should feel ashamed of the civilization that we inherited. So as I'm stood here next to this innocuous looking railway line, just think about it. This would have been hand dug by our ancestors, much like the canals, much like all the infrastructure, you know. And as I'm stood here, I want to say something very clearly. I'm proud of my heritage. I'm proud of the achievements, the sacrifices and the values that built the society that I grew up in, that you grew up in. And I reject the idea that loving your country automatically makes you hateful or a racist, because patriotism and racism are not the same thing. At the end of the day, wanting social cohesion, it's not extremism. Wanting safe communities, it's not hatred. Wanting your children to inherit a stable and confident society is not something that decent people ever need to apologise for. In fact, I think part of the problem is this. For too long, normal people have abandoned patriotism altogether because they feared being associated with extremists. So the loudest and the most divisive voices have claimed ownership of identity, of the flags, the heritage and the national pride, whilst all of the time the silent majority stayed silent. But why should we surrender those things? Why can't we build a society that is strong but compassionate, welcoming but united, confident without being arrogant? Because a healthy nation should absolutely welcome people who genuinely want to contribute, who genuinely want to integrate and become part of a wider national story. But that only works if the story itself still exists. And right now, I think that millions of people instinctively feel that that is fading. And this is why society feels fractured, because people are searching everywhere for that sense of belonging. And some people find it in healthy things, you know, family, discipline, community, faith, service, and responsibility. But others get pulled into outrage, ideological tribes, online extremism, and endless division. But underneath of it, it's all the same human need. The need to belong to something meaningful. And when societies stop giving people these healthy forms of identity and purpose, they will always search for a replacement. And history has proven this and shown this to us time and time again. I try and read the comments on as many of the videos that are produced, you know, so we can engage as a community. And a lot of the time people have said that they appreciate how I'm able to stay just in the facts rather than opinions, to stay nuanced. And I understand that, but I also think that the time has now come for me to truly set out my stall, you know, to define the hill that I'm prepared to die on. And that hill is this. Civilization matters. The truth matters. We have to question everything. Family matters. Strong communities matter. And identity and belonging matter. and also that future generations deserve more than just confusion, fragmentation, and spiritual emptiness. Because if we continue to teach people that they should reject their roots, reject responsibility, and reject the very foundations that once held society together, then eventually society is going to start to tear itself apart. Not overnight, but slowly, one generation at a time. And this matters to me so much because I'm not talking about abstract politics anymore. I'm talking about our children, because every parent understands that sacrifice. You spend years and years and years protecting your children, teaching them right from wrong, trying to prepare them for the world when you're not around. But what are we actually leaving behind for them? You know, a society without shared values, without a community, without meaning, without trust, without belonging. One day, our children and grandchildren will ask us, like they did in the war, what we did while the world around us was changing. And every one of us will have to answer that question. Because the greatest threat society is facing, it's not disagreement, it's passivity. You know, too many decent people stay silent because they fear ridicule more than the decline itself. You know, people are terrified of being criticised online, whilst the foundations of their own society is eroding around them. You know, history doesn't remember the generations that stayed comfortable and stayed silent. It remembers the generations who stood up when it mattered. And this is why I've created Nation of Sleepers. Not to spread hatred, not to create division, but to wake people up. Ultimately, I'm here to hold up a mirror to you all, to remind you that meaning still matters, that family still matters, that truth still matters, that heritage and our culture still matters. And the future that we leave behind for the next generation matters more than anything, because we are only temporary custodians of the civilization that we inhabit, but we did not build. But we are responsible for what comes next. So let me leave you with one last question. What kind of nations are we leaving to our children? And if there's enough people that still care about the answers, then maybe it's time for us to raise the colours, to rally the troops, and get everyone behind us to save this nation and each of the nations which is falling rapidly. The sleepers are waking up. You know, follow me on the Nation of Sleepers. Let's do this together.